Welcome to Knowledge Targeting from TI1 Voice. This is part 15 of 50, Remote Neural Monitoring, Reading the Mind from a Distance. Over the next 2 hours, we examine the most overreached claim in this entire series, and we examine it carefully. Real neural science exists. A real patent exists. Whether either one adds up to a device that reads a chosen person's thoughts, covertly at a distance, is the question we will actually test. That sentence opens our chapter. It sits inside a compiled document known in the targeted individual literature as MindWeapon, cataloged in our knowledge base as Item 19. Buried in a list the compiler labels brain wave analyzers, a purpose is attached: to read the minds of targets completely yet covertly. It is an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims deserve exactly the scrutiny we bring here. Not dismissal and not credulity. Something else entirely. Knowledge Targeting is a 50-part documentary series built by TI1 Voice. Each part takes one subject out of the community's own literature and works through it slowly, in public, with the sources named on screen. We do not campaign and we do not debunk. We audit. That means saying plainly what has been demonstrated, what merely exists on paper, and what remains a claim awaiting evidence, and never letting one stand in for another. Part 14, immediately before this one, examines synthetic telepathy and the brain-machine interface, the claim of an outbound channel writing sound or sensation into a person's perception. This hour reverses the arrow. Remote neural monitoring claims an inbound channel, reading activity out of a brain without consent. Part 16 then looks upward to satellite-based surveillance and targeting systems. 35 episodes follow this one, so nothing said here is a closing verdict. This series is made by TI1 Voice, and the platform behind it sits at one.witisk.org. There you will find the evidence library, where members store and timestamp their own documentation, the knowledge base that every episode is written from, and the community wall, where people compare notes without being told what they are permitted to conclude. Membership costs nothing, and the material you upload stays yours. We also run TITV, a live stream running around the clock at meet.witisk.org, under public TITV. Episodes of this series play there in rotation alongside interviews, archive material, and quiet hours for people who simply do not want to be alone at 3 in the morning. Every part also carries a written companion article with the full citation list so you can check every claim yourself in your own time. Here is how this hour was assembled. The written chapter is the spine. Around it we run retrieval across the TI1 Voice knowledge base, thousands of documents, books, filings and wiki entries, and pull the passages that genuinely bear on this subject. Retrieval is loose by nature, so anything that wandered in from a neighboring topic was discarded rather than used. Sources are named, and what we could not verify is labeled unverified. The editorial rule for this hour is a 3-way split, and it never blurs. Demonstrated means a named study, named authors, a journal, a result another laboratory can repeat. Filed means a document exists, a patent, a contract, a proposal which proves the filing and nothing further. Claimed means testimony or inference, reported faithfully and labeled as such. Real neural decoding sits in the first register. A covert mind-reading weapon does not. A word to targets watching. If you have experienced your private thoughts seeming to be known to other people, that experience is real, and the distress is real, and nothing in this hour is an invitation to doubt yourself. What we test is a proposed mechanism, not a person's honesty. Those are different questions. Keep documenting dates, times, what happened, who was present. A record survives hostile questioning in a way memory alone cannot. The hour proceeds in 6 movements. First, the claim exactly as the document states it. Second, what a granted United States patent actually proves, and what the patent office never tests. Third, the real science underneath all of this, magnetoencephalography, and the superconducting sensors that make it possible. Fourth, the specific study at a named federal laboratory that the document cites. Fifth, the physics of distance. Sixth, the 3 layers side by side. Everything in this chapter is anchored to one document, cataloged in our knowledge base as 19, and known in the literature as Mind Weapon. It is a compilation, not a single author's original research. It gathers patent numbers, program names, and excerpts from outside studies into one running argument. We lean on 2 of its sections, the one naming a United States patent, and the one naming a federal laboratory's schizophrenia study. Read it yourself. A compilation is only as strong as its weakest citation, and its persuasive power comes from placement. Put a verifiable fact, a genuine patent number, a real laboratory's name, directly beside an unverified claim, and the reader's eye slides across the seam without ever noticing it. Call that citation laundering. It is not unique to this literature. It runs through health misinformation and intelligence conspiracies alike. Our method is to find the seam. Here is the entry itself. Under the heading Brain Wave Analyzer sits a single line. Remote neural monitoring and electronic brain linking via satellite, United States Patent 6011991, dated the 4th of January 2000. That is a precise, checkable citation. Anyone can pull the filing tonight. Naming the inventor on a public patent is not naming a perpetrator, and we allege nothing about any individual. Read the purpose clause slowly because its construction rewards attention. 3 violent verbs, rob, rape, terrorize, stacked for maximum totality. Then oppress completely. Then the one word doing all of the evidentiary work, covertly. Covertness asserts that the thing cannot be observed by ordinary means, because the premise is that the target never perceives it happening. That is not automatically false. It does mean the claim needs carrying by something beyond perception. Covert programs against citizens are not hypothetical. The FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, ran from 1956 to 1971, infiltrating and disrupting lawful political groups. It became known because burglars removed files from an office in Media, Pennsylvania, in 1971, and because the Church Committee held Senate hearings in 75 and 76. Notice carefully how it was proven. Documents, testimony, court records. Never by what the targets themselves could perceive. So the honest question is never whether covert operations can exist. They can, and they have. The question is whether this particular purpose clause arrives with anything comparable. A declassified file, a congressional record, a court judgment, one documented case. As written in the compilation, it arrives with a patent number and nothing else. That gap is worth naming precisely, and naming it is a stronger position than believing or dismissing the whole thing. One piece of housekeeping, because this series has already used a neighboring term. Part 14 dealt with the outbound direction. Writing a voice or a sensation into somebody's perception. This chapter deals with the inbound direction. Reading activity out of a brain without cooperation. They are not the same claim. Conflating them lets a critic who answers one appear to have answered both, and lets a believer smuggle the second in behind the first. Remote neural monitoring sounds like one technical term. It is really 8 separate claims wearing a single phrase as a coat, and each could be true or false independently of the others. A device might monitor brain activity at close range with no satellite involved at all. A satellite might track a person's movements while contributing nothing whatever to reading their neurons. Bundling all 8 makes the whole feel unified. Unbundling is step 1. Real decoding does exist, and it is genuinely impressive. In 2023, Alexander Huth's group at the University of Texas published a semantic decoder in Nature Neuroscience. It recovered the gist of stories a person was hearing, the gist, not the words, while that person lay motionless inside a functional MRI scanner, after roughly 16 hours of training scans on that one individual. A participant defeated it by thinking about something else. Hold one number as we go. The magnetic field a brain produces measures around 100 femtotesla at the scalp, and a femtotesla is 1/4,000,000th of a Tesla. The Earth's own field runs near 50 microtesla, some 500 million times stronger. That is why magnetoencephalography needs sensors millimeters from the head, chilled near absolute zero, inside a shielded room. Next, the citation itself, what a granted patent actually proves. 8 claims, then, wearing one phrase as a coat. We unbundle them the only honest way, one at a time, starting with the least glamorous. Before any argument about satellites or covertness, there is a checkable object sitting at the center of the citation. A patent number. So let us do the boring, essential work first, and verify what is actually verifiable. Everything else in this chapter depends on getting that one step right. United States Patent Number 6,011,991 exists in the public patent record. Its title, exactly as filed, is Communication System and Method including Brain Wave Analysis. The named inventor is A. Martirosyan. The grant date is the 4th of January, 2000. None of that requires you to trust the targeted individual literature, or to trust us. It requires only that somebody pull the public filing and read it. The patent is searchable 2 ways, both free. The Patent Office runs a portal called Patent Public Search. Google Patents carries the same document at patents.google.com/patent/US60119991A. No login, no clearance, no Freedom of Information request. That is worth saying plainly, because so much of this subject gets waved away wholesale on the reasonable-sounding grounds that none of it is real. Here, at least something is. Confirming that costs us nothing and buys us a great deal. It means this chapter no longer has to argue about whether the patent exists. It exists in the ordinary, boring, bureaucratic sense that an office issued it and filed it away. Which frees us for the more interesting and more honest question, and it is the question the rest of the hour turns on. Not whether the patent exists, but what its existence actually tells us. Sit with the number for a moment, because its ordinariness is informative in a way that is easy to miss. This is not a classified defense file. It is not a leaked internal memo. It is not a document that needed a whistleblower to surface. It is a standard, unclassified United States utility patent, prosecuted through the same open process that protects inventions for kitchen gadgets and industrial machinery, and searchable by anybody. That ordinariness cuts in both directions, and we are not going to resolve the tension for you. On one hand, it undercuts the idea of a deeply buried secret. The filing has sat in the open for 25 years. On the other, it should trouble the strongest version of the covert weapon claim. A genuinely deployed intelligence device would be an extraordinary thing to describe in a public document designed to invite licensing, scrutiny, and lawsuits. A word on the phrase itself, since we will use it all hour. The knowledge base defines remote neural monitoring as a concept in targeted individual literature, alleging that neural activity can be detected and interpreted from a distance. It also records, plainly, that no scientific consensus supports that capability. And on the patents, it gives the standard objection. Filings do not necessarily correspond to operational systems, and the technology described may never have been deployed. Here is the piece of patent law this whole chapter turns on, and it is widely misunderstood. To grant a utility patent under Title 35 of the United States Code, the office asks 4 things. Is the invention useful? Section 101. Is it novel? Section 102. Is it non-obvious to a person of ordinary skill in the art? Section 103. And is it described clearly enough that such a person could, in principle, build it? In principle is doing heavy lifting in that sentence. The legal standard is called enablement, codified at Title 35, Section 112A, and elaborated for examiners in the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure at Section 2164. The specification must also disclose the inventor's best mode of carrying out the invention, though the America Invents Act of 2011 changed the consequences of failing to do so. Every one of those tests is applied to a document. And here is the other half, the half that matters most. What the Patent Office does not require and never tests is whether the device was ever built, whether it works as described, whether it was manufactured, sold, or fielded by anyone, or whether the underlying physics holds up at the range and the scale the application describes. Those questions are not asked, not answered, and not part of the grant. The Patent Office does not maintain a laboratory. It does not construct prototypes. It does not verify experimental results. Its examiners are trained in the relevant art and compare an application against the prior art, the body of earlier patents, published science, and other public material. Their determination is intellectual, not empirical. They judge whether a claim is sufficiently described and sufficiently distinct. They do not judge whether it functions in the physical world. Millions of granted patents describe devices that were never built beyond the paper description, and almost always for entirely ordinary reasons that have nothing to do with secrecy. The inventor could not raise the money. The technology was overtaken before anyone shipped it. The market did not appear. Or the described embodiment simply failed when somebody finally tried to build it. Unbuilt is the normal state of a patent, not a suspicious one. The knowledge base preserves a striking example of the confusion this creates. A patent application published in 2020 on identifying victims of voice-to-skull and remote neural monitoring cites a 1974 patent number 3,951,134 and calls it, quote, the U.S. Public Technology Patent for Remote Reading Human Thoughts. A filing offered as proof about a filing. The knowledge base records 3 physical flaws in that older mechanism. So hold the distinction firmly, because it is not legal arcana. A patent is a right to exclude others from making, using, or selling the claimed invention for a limited term. It is a property right. It is not a certificate of operability. That is the difference between a patent and a product, between a claim and a capability, and it is the single most misunderstood thing in this entire subject. Who filed it? The named inventor is Aris Mardirosyan, an inventor and entrepreneur with a substantial portfolio. Dozens of United States patents, many of them assigned to Technology Patents, a Maryland holding company. His work runs through wireless communication systems, location-based services, and methods for transmitting and processing physiological data. That is the boundary zone between telecommunications engineering and medical monitoring, and it is exactly where this particular patent sits. Read the title once more, slowly, because it is careful in a way that rewards attention. Communication system and method including brain wave analysis. It does not say mind reading. It does not say thought decoding. It does not say surveillance. It claims a communication system that includes brain wave analysis as one component. That distinction is not pedantry. It is most of the gap between what the document says and what the citation implies. So what does the specification actually describe? Brain electrical activity, detected through conventional electroencephalographic electrodes placed on the scalp, used as an input to a communication device. EEG signals are analyzed to spot particular brain states, and those states then control a communication function. Placing a call, selecting a contact, sending a message. The listed components are ordinary. Electrodes, amplifiers, signal processors, wireless transmitters. This is, in its broadest conception, a brain-computer interface. Because real neural decoding does exist. In 2023, Jerry Tang and Alexander Huth recovered the gist of a story from fMRI in Nature Neuroscience, after each participant spent about 16 hours inside the scanner. The same year, Francis Willett's team reported 62 words a minute from electrodes implanted in the motor cortex. Both are real. Both required contact, consent, and hours of that one person's own data. Neither reads unprompted thought. Neither works at a distance. And here is what the patent never describes: detection at a distance, through walls, from orbit, or without the subject's knowledge and cooperation. The word remote in this filing means remote communication, controlling a device with a brain signal instead of a thumb. Not remote sensing of an unwitting brain. The physics agrees. Scalp signals are tens of microvolts, the brain's magnetic field is femtotesla, and both fall away steeply with distance. None of which makes the patent trivial. A communication system driven by brain activity was genuinely forward-looking in the year 2000. But what it describes is short-range, contact-based, and cooperative. Holding that apart from the covert claim is not a dismissal of anyone's experience. It is what lets the strongest parts of a target's case survive hostile questioning. Next, we climb the distance between the two readings, rung by rung. So read the source document's citation line once more, and count the verbs. The patent exists. The patent describes a mechanism. The mechanism works. Someone built it and used it against a real person. For claims, for different kinds of evidence packed into a single breath. Only the first is settled by pulling the filing. The other three are separate questions, and the citation never asks them. Let us ask them one rung at a time. Picture a ladder with 4 rungs. Rung 1. The document exists. Rung 2. It describes a mechanism on paper in the careful language patent application's use. Rung 3. That mechanism actually works, the physics performs as written. Rung 4. Somebody built a working version and fielded it, covertly, against a real human being. The source document plants its foot on rung 1 and gestures at rung 4. Rungs 2 and 3 go unexamined. Rungs 1 and 2 we can settle in an afternoon. The filing is public, unclassified, and searchable. Its examiners judged novelty, non-obviousness, and whether the description was clear enough to follow. That is a paper standard, met on paper. No examiner wound a coil. No examiner ran an experiment. So rung 2 tells us an idea was written down well. It does not tell us the idea survives contact with the physical world. Rung 3 would need a bench, a built device, measured output, a published method, and a second laboratory getting the same result. Rung 4 would need something different again, procurement records, contracts, a serial number, a whistleblower who handled the thing, or one properly documented case with an investigation attached. Those are ordinary evidentiary demands. We make them of every other technology claim. Here, for this claim, they have never been met. And here the plainest verdict comes from inside the community itself. Eleanor White, in her Tech Talk paper held in the TI One Voice knowledge base, writes that remote neural monitoring, reading the state of someone's brain and nervous system at a distance, has never been demonstrated by a mainstream source under its own name, even at next-door neighbor distances. She adds that the term appeals to targets. That is a researcher policing her own side's vocabulary. Going rung by rung is not a polite way of saying no. Blanket dismissal and blanket belief make the same mistake from opposite directions. Both skip the middle. The slow climb is the only method that can tell a target something useful, namely, exactly where the documented record stops and where inference begins. So we have taken the patent as far as it honestly goes. Now the science underneath it, which is remarkable. Section 5. Before we can judge any claim about reading a brain from a distance, we need the real science, and the real science is genuinely astonishing. There is a magnetic field around your head right now. It is fantastically weak, it is measurable, and physicists have been measuring it since the 1960s. Understanding exactly how they do it, and what it costs them to do it, settles a great deal. When a group of neurons fires, ions cross their membranes, and that movement of charge is an electrical current flowing along the cell's geometry. Every electrical current, without exception, wraps a magnetic field around its axis. That is not a special property of brains. It is Maxwell's equations and the Biot-Savart law, the same physics that governs a radio mast and the aurora. So the brain broadcasts a magnetic echo of itself, whether or not anyone listens. Electroencephalography is the older technique, and it is genuinely old. In the 1920s, the German psychiatrist Hans Berger made the first recordings of human brain electricity and named the alpha rhythm, that 8 to 12 Hz oscillation that appears when you close your eyes and relax. EEG works by contact. Electrodes sit on the scalp, bridged to the skin with conductive gel. Nothing about it happens at a distance, then or now. But EEG pays a price. Electrical signals from the brain must cross the skull, the cerebrospinal fluid, the membranes around the brain, and the scalp before they reach an electrode, and each layer conducts differently. Bone in particular conducts badly. The current spreads sideways, and what arrives at the electrode is a blurred, spatially averaged version of what actually fired. EEG sees the brain, but through frosted glass. That limitation is exactly what magnetoencephalography was invented to solve. Magnetoencephalography, MEG, measures the magnetic side of the same activity, and it does not touch the head at all. Here is why that matters. Biological tissue is essentially non-magnetic. Its magnetic permeability is almost identical to empty space. So the skull, the fluid, and the scalp are effectively transparent to these fields. The magnetic pattern outside your head is therefore a far more faithful picture of the currents inside it. Because it avoids that smearing, MEG localizes sources better than EEG, and it has become indispensable for mapping the brain before neurosurgery, particularly in epilepsy patients being assessed for an operation. Hold on to one detail, though, because the whole chapter turns on it. The sensors sit centimeters from the scalp, inside a helmet, inside a shielded room. Non-contact is not the same thing as remote. Non-contact means a few centimeters of air. This is where the two registers get quietly welded together. Some writers reason that because MEG detects brain activity without touching the head, remote detection must be possible in principle. The knowledge base entry on event-related potentials records exactly that argument being made. But the step from centimeters to meters, let alone to orbit, is not a small extension of the same idea. It is a different physical problem entirely, and we will see why. The history here is worth walking through, because it is almost never told properly. It does not begin with the brain. It begins with the heart, with a graduate student's prediction about superconductors, and with a car company's research laboratory in Michigan. For dates carry the whole story: 1929, 1962, 1963, and 1964. Only after all four does anyone manage to hear the brain magnetically at all. In 1963, Gerhard Ball and Richard McPhee at Syracuse University made the first magnetic recording of a human heart, a magnetocardiogram. Their detector was a pair of copper coils wound on a ferrite core, carrying 2 million turns of wire, held over the chest of a subject sitting inside a magnetically shielded room. It took that, plus relentless signal averaging, to hear a heart from a few centimeters away. The signal they recovered was about 50 picotesla, roughly 1/1,000,000th of the Earth's ambient magnetic field. Sit with that ratio for a moment. To measure a beating heart, they had to pull a whisper out of a permanent roar, and they only managed it by shutting the roar out with thick metal walls and averaging for a very long time. The brain, roughly 100 times fainter, would prove very much harder. The brain's magnetic field is roughly 100 times weaker than the heart's, and hundreds of millions of times weaker than the Earth's ambient field. Copper coils, even with millions of turns, simply could not reach it. This is the moment the story could have stopped. What was needed was not a better coil but a fundamentally different kind of detector, one built out of quantum mechanics rather than out of wire. That detector arrived in 1964 from an unlikely address. Arnold Silver and James Zimmerman, working at the Ford Motor Company Scientific Laboratory in Dearborn, Michigan, built the first superconducting quantum interference device, the SQUID. It was not designed for neuroscience. It came out of basic research into superconductivity, funded by a car manufacturer, in an era when American industry paid for pure physics. Zimmerman later took the work to the National Bureau of Standards in Boulder. Inside, a SQUID is a loop of superconductor interrupted by two Josephson junctions, thin barriers that the superconducting wave function tunnels straight across. Brian Josephson predicted that tunneling in 1962, as a Cambridge graduate student. Magnetic flux through such a loop cannot take any value it likes. It comes in whole multiples of 1 flux quantum, about 2 femtoweber. Feed the loop a current, and its voltage oscillates with the flux threading it. Lock onto one of those oscillations with feedback, and a SQUID resolves magnetic changes of a few femtotesla, a femtotesla being 1/millionth of 1/billionth of a Tesla. That is about 1/50 billionth of the Earth's field. It is among the most sensitive measurements humanity has ever made, and it explains why shielding is not a luxury but a physical necessity. Next, David Cohen and the room he built at MIT in 1968. So the sensor existed and the physics was understood. What was still missing was the measurement itself. It came in 1968 at the Francis Bitter National Magnet Laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where a physicist named David Cohen sat a volunteer inside a shielded chamber and recorded, for the first time in human history, the magnetic field of a living human brain from outside the skull. It is worth slowing down here. Cohen was not a neuroscientist. He was a physicist who had become fascinated by the problem of measuring the body's faintest magnetic fields, and who understood, better than almost anyone then alive, that such a measurement makes two demands at the same time. The sensor must be extraordinarily sensitive. The room around it must be extraordinarily quiet. Miss either one and what you record is the building, the traffic, and the earth. The apparatus was, by modern standards, almost comically modest. One sensor, a single-channel SQUID magnetometer, cooled in a flask of liquid helium and positioned above the volunteer's head. Not the 275-channel helmets of today. The volunteer sat inside a shielded room Cohen had designed and built himself, lined with layer upon layer of magnetic alloy, backed by coils that actively canceled whatever fields still crept in. And what he recorded was not the brain's spontaneous chatter. It was an evoked field, the brain's magnetic answer to a stimulus he controlled, a flash of light or a click in the ear. He presented it again and again and again, then averaged several hundred trials together. Random noise cancels when you average. The response, locked to the moment of the stimulus, survives. Out of that arithmetic came a waveform. Hold on to that because it constrains everything that follows. Averaging works only if you already know when the signal ought to arrive. You need a stimulus you control, repeated on a schedule you set, in a person who consents and stays still. A single unrepeated thought, arriving at a moment nobody chose, is precisely the thing this method cannot recover. That constraint is not a relic of 1968. It is arithmetic. The paper appeared in the journal Science in 1968, understated in its claims and revolutionary in what it implied. Three things were now established. The brain's magnetic field could be detected from outside an intact skull, could be localized roughly to a region, and it could be done without surgery, without radiation, and without the smearing the skull imposes on electrical recordings. A whole field of science was born. Through the 1970s, Cohen and his collaborators refined the method. Among them was James Zimmerman, who had moved from Ford's laboratories to the National Bureau of Standards and kept improving the SQUID itself. The work was punishing. With one channel you mapped ahead by moving the sensor from position to position, recording at each spot, assembling the picture piece by piece. A session ran for hours, and the subject stayed almost motionless. That passage circulates widely in targeting literature, and it is quoted accurately. It comes from Robert Becker's book The Body Electric, reproduced in the Mind Justice report held in our knowledge base. And the underlying fact is true. By the mid-1970s, a New York University group was recording brain magnetism with no shielded room at all in downtown Manhattan. The question is what that achievement removed, and what it left exactly where it stood. What it removed was the room. What it did not remove was the distance. The trick is the gradiometer. Two pickup coils wound in opposition, a few centimeters apart. A field arriving from far away looks nearly identical at both, so the difference between them collapses to almost nothing. A current just beneath the nearer coil does not. Manhattan was cancelled by geometry. The sensor still sat against the volunteer's scalp. The step that turned all of this from a physics demonstration into a hospital instrument was simple in concept and brutal in engineering. Stop moving one sensor around the head. Build an array, dozens, then hundreds of sensors, fixed inside a helmet-shaped flask of liquid helium. The first multi-channel systems appeared in the 1980s, from groups in Finland, Japan, Germany, and the United States. By the 1990s, you could simply buy one. Our knowledge base entry on magnetoencephalography records the commercial arrival precisely. By the mid-1980s, systems of 37 to 122 channels were on sale from Neuromag in Finland, CTF Systems in Canada, and 4D Neuroimaging in the United States. The helmet is the shape that resulted, and it tells you something. The head goes inside it. That is the working distance of this technology, and it has never changed. CTF Systems was founded in 1979 in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, and became one of the world's leading suppliers. Its 275-channel machine was the state-of-the-art around the turn of the century, and it is the system named in the National Institute of Mental Health reference our source document leans on. Every one of those channels is an axial gradiometer. That detail matters more than the headline number. The Defense Advisory Group Jason examined exactly this question for the Pentagon in a report held in our knowledge base. Their verdict on magnetic sensing was blunt. In principle, a very large array could map neuronal currents through tissue, but cooling and array size are the problem, and the sensor must be insulated from the very body it is pressed against. And then the sentence everyone should quote, "Brain signals are basically encrypted to us." So what does the real instrument do for actual people? Two things mostly, and both are serious medicine. In patients whose epilepsy resists every drug, magnetoencephalography locates the tissue generating the seizures before a surgeon opens the skull, often more precisely than EEG, and without implanting electrodes. And it maps the functions that must be spared: language, movement, sensation. Surgeons plan their operations around those maps. This happens every week. It is worth being emphatic here. Magnetoencephalography is not fringe, and it is not classified. It is textbook physics and mainstream medicine, taught in graduate programs in neuroscience and medical physics, practiced from Helsinki to Boston to Bethesda. Our knowledge base entry on functional neuroimaging gives the numbers: 2 to 3 millimeters of spatial resolution, timing accurate to the millisecond, and, in every case, a shielded room and superconducting sensors. And here is where the honest line gets drawn. Our knowledge base entry on the SQUID states the physics without decoration. The magnetic field of a single neuron falls away as 1 over the distance cubed, and the field of an entire cortical column, 100,000 cells firing in concert, is detectable only at a range of a few millimeters. Not meters. Millimeters. Every doubling of distance costs you a factor of 8. Which raises the obvious question. If the signal is that faint, and it dies away that fast, how does the sensor pick it up at all? The answer is not electronics as most of us understand the word. It is quantum mechanics, running 4 degrees above absolute zero, exploited with enormous ingenuity. To judge any claim made about this technology, it helps to know what is actually happening inside that flask of helium. Superconductivity was discovered in 1911 by the Dutch physicist Heike Kamerlingh Onnes, who cooled mercury below 4.2 Kelvin, the temperature of liquid helium, and watched its electrical resistance vanish abruptly and completely. For nearly 50 years, nobody could explain it. Then in 1957, John Bardeen, Leon Cooper, and John Robert Schrieffer published the theory that carries their initials. Electrons bind into pairs and flow without scattering. Two consequences of that paired state make the squid possible. The first is zero direct current resistance. Start a current going around a superconducting loop and it circulates forever, because nothing remains to dissipate it. The second is stranger. The magnetic flux threading such a loop cannot take just any value at all. It is forced into whole multiples of one fundamental quantum, Planck's constant, divided by twice the electron charge. So the loop behaves like a magnetic flywheel, generating whatever current it must to keep the flux in whole units. Now break it with a Josephson junction, two superconductors separated by a barrier thin enough for paired electrons to tunnel across, and the loop's response becomes periodic. Voltage rises and falls as flux slides past. Counting those oscillations is how a femtotesla gets measured. What it must be counted against is a world of noise. So the squid works. A superconducting loop, two Josephson junctions, and a feedback circuit that resolves a few femtotesla in a 1 Hz band. That is the most sensitive magnetic detector humanity has built. And yet no laboratory on Earth uses one to listen to a brain without first building a room around it. Why? The answer is not about sensors at all. It is about noise and the ratio between noise and signal. In 1986, at IBM's Zurich Research Laboratory, George Bednors and Alex Muller found that certain copper oxide ceramics turned superconducting far warmer than anyone expected. Above 77 Kelvin, the boiling point of liquid nitrogen, rather than the 4.2 Kelvin of liquid helium. They took the Nobel Prize in Physics the following year. The practical promise was obvious. Nitrogen cooling is cheap, light, and small. Helium cooling is none of those things. That discovery sits in a long line. Kamerlingh Onnes cooled mercury in 1911 and watched its resistance vanish. Bardeen, Cooper, and Schrieffer explained why in 1957. David Cohen recorded the first magnetoencephalogram in 1968. Then came the ceramics, the Nobel, and within a decade commercial high-temperature squids, sold for geophysical prospecting and for non-destructive testing of metals. Every step is real, published, and dated. Hold on to that word. Published. Here the argument turns. Some advocates of covert neural monitoring point at high-temperature squids and see a bridge, from the shielded laboratory to a van, a rooftop, a street. Portable cooling, portable sensor, portable mind reading. The knowledge base entry on Josephson junctions records that same inference, and records what supports it. Its verdict is blunt. No reliable public evidence of any such deployment. That is a claim, not a finding. Compare them honestly. A modern low-temperature squid resolves 1 to 5 femtotesla per root hertz. The best optimized high-temperature devices reach 10 to 50. That gap has narrowed steadily, and it may narrow further. But notice what the comparison does not touch. Both figures describe a sensor's own noise. Neither describes the room. And the room, as we are about to see, is where this argument is actually decided. Sensitivity was never the bottleneck. Read that carefully because it is the hinge of the whole chapter. The shielding around a magnetoencephalography system is not there because the sensors are weak. It is there because the signal being hunted is smaller than the noise surrounding it by a factor of thousands. No detector, however exquisite, can pull a signal out of noise that overlaps it in frequency, in space and in time. That is arithmetic, not engineering fashion. Put the numbers side by side. The brain's magnetic field at the scalp runs roughly 100 to 1000 femtotesla. To see it, the total noise, everything from the building, the street, and the instrument itself must sit at or below a few femtotesla per root hertz. In an ordinary unshielded room, The noise floor is 1,000 to 10,000 times larger than the signal. Not weak, invisible. Start with the Earth itself. Its magnetic field runs 25,000 to 65,000 nanotesla, about half a Gauss at mid-latitudes. That steady field is not the problem. It barely changes. The problem is its shape. Steel beams, reinforced concrete, elevators, filing cabinets, passing cars, even a subject's dental fillings bend that field into gradients. And the moment anything moves through a gradient, a static field becomes a changing one. Here is how little movement it takes. Imagine a gradient of 1 nanotesla per millimeter, modest, unremarkable, the sort of thing an ordinary building produces. Now let the subject shift in their chair by a single millimeter. The measured field changes by 1,000 femtotesla. That one movement has already produced a signal as large as the entire brain response you were trying to record. A millimeter. In a chair. Now add everything that carries current. Mains power at 50 or 60 Hz, and its harmonics, which fall squarely inside the frequency band where brain rhythms live. Elevator motors. Heating and ventilation compressors. Fluorescent light ballasts, computer power supplies, radio, television, cellular, and wireless transmissions, which can couple straight into the measurement electronics without ever touching the brain signal. Each one is ordinary. Together they bury 100 femtotesla without effort. Set them out as a list and the scale of the problem becomes plain. 9 families of interference, each with its own frequency signature, its own timing, its own amplitude. Some are steady and predictable. Some arrive without warning. A lorry outside, a lift called to the 4th floor, a technician crossing the room. Magnetoencephalography does not fight one noise source. It fights a whole ecology of them continuously and all at once. And then there is the sky. Geomagnetic micropulsations, natural ripples in the Earth's field driven by the solar wind, add broadband noise from below 1 Hz to tens of hertz. The same knowledge-based document that quotes the physicist Steve Swithenby also asserts that squid technology underpins classified remote brainwave reading. The quote is sourced. The assertion is not. Notice how easily they sit on one page, side by side. There is a standard rescue in physics. Average. Repeat the trial hundreds of times, and random noise shrinks while the signal survives. It fails here, and the reason matters. Environmental magnetic noise is not random with respect to the brain's rhythms. It carries power at the same frequencies. Averaging refines a signal you can already detect. It cannot conjure one out of noise that shares its band. So you shield. The defense is a magnetically shielded room, lined with mu metal. Mu metal is a nickel-iron alloy, roughly 77% nickel, 16% iron, 5% copper, and 2% chromium or molybdenum, with extraordinarily high magnetic permeability. Field lines entering it prefer to travel through the metal rather than through the air it encloses. The knowledge base notes that targets often name mu metal as the one real material that blocks magnetic fields. It is. How well it works depends on 4 things: the permeability of the alloy, the thickness of each layer, the geometry. Spheres and cylinders shield better than boxes. And the openings, because every door, every ventilation port, every cable penetration is a leak. Practical rooms use 2 to 4 concentric mu metal layers, separated by non-magnetic spacers, each one attenuating what got past the last. Together they cut the ambient field 1,000-fold or more. At powerline frequencies, a well-built shield delivers 40 to 60 decibels of attenuation. But getting there is an ordeal. Mu metal must be annealed after fabrication to reach full permeability, and handled gently, because work hardening it during construction degrades the shielding. The room must be isolated from building vibration, since a wall that flexes changes the flux through it. The floor must be aluminium or wood. No steel reinforcement anywhere in the structure. Everything inside must be non-magnetic too. The subject's chair, the stimulus equipment, the frame holding the doer, because a single ferromagnetic object inside the shield creates local gradients that ruin the measurement. What you end up with costs between $500,000 and $2 million, weighs tens of tons, and needs its own foundations, vibration isolation, and temperature control. It is a building, not a briefcase. It does not travel. Most modern installations add a second layer, active compensation. Reference magnetometers placed outside or at the edge of the room measure whatever residual field survives the mu metal. Large coils surrounding the measurement volume are then driven to cancel it in real time. That buys another 20 to 40 decibels at low frequencies, exactly where passive shielding is weakest. But it only works once the passive shield has brought the field within the coil's linear range. Stack the budget up and the picture is complete. Passive shielding and active compensation together bring the noise floor down to the few femtotesla level where brain signals emerge. Remove either one and the signal vanishes back into the noise. And even then, the measurement stays fragile. A passing truck, a nearby lift, a subject's heartbeat nudging their head, a technician's wristwatch, any of these can swamp the recording. MEG technicians keep an almost monastic magnetic hygiene. None of this is a reason to wave complaints away. The knowledge base holds McMurtry's argument that flat rejection is as presumptuous as flat belief, and he is owed an answer rather than a shrug. So the answer this chapter gives is not dismissal. It is arithmetic. And in the next section we put the actual number on it, the ratio between a brain's field and everything around it. Hundreds of millions to one. So the shielded room, the cooled sensors, the monastic care with wristwatches and elevators, all of that exists for a reason. Now let us put an actual number on the faintness we have been describing, because the number is more extreme than intuition suggests. It is the central physical fact that this chapter, and every claim of remote neural monitoring, must reckon with first. One number and everything else follows from it. Typical neuromagnetic fields measured at the scalp run on the order of 100 to 1000 femtotesla. That is the whole signal. Every published magnetoencephalography result, every source reconstruction, every clinical mapping of a seizure focus rests on capturing something in that range. Hold the figure in mind, because the rest of this section does nothing but compare it with the ordinary magnetic world it sits inside. Nothing here is speculative. A femtotesla is 10 to the minus 15 tesla, 1/millionth of 1/billionth of a tesla. Written out, that is a decimal point followed by 14 zeros before the first digit. No familiar object in daily life produces a field that small, which is precisely the problem. The instrument must pick out a quantity for which ordinary experience offers no comparison, inside a world saturated with fields millions of times stronger. Set the ordinary magnetic world beside it. A refrigerator magnet at its surface produces about 1/100th of a tesla, 10 trillion times the brain's signal. The wiring in a typical home 1 meter away produces roughly 100 nanotesla, 100 million times larger. Because these quantities span so many decades, the bars here show powers of 10. Each step upward is a tenfold increase, and the ladder climbs a very long way. Move closer to home, into the body itself. The tiny currents flowing in the subject's own heart produce a magnetic field of roughly 50,000 femtotesla at the chest wall, the magnetocardiogram. That is between 50 and 500 times larger than the brain's field at the scalp. A person's own heartbeat is, magnetically speaking, a shout standing next to a whisper, and it is inside the shielded room with them. Now the largest term. The Earth's own ambient magnetic field runs between 25,000 and 65,000 nanotesla, depending on latitude. A nanotesla is 10 to the minus 9 tesla, already 1,000,000 times larger than a femtotesla. Converted to one common unit, the Earth's field at a mid-latitude site is about 5 times 10 to the 10th femtotesla. The brain's signal in those same units is 100 to 1000. Divide one by the other and the ratio comes out on the order of 5 times 10 to the 7th, up to 5 times 10 to the 8th. In plain terms, the brain's magnetic field is somewhere between 50 million and 500 million times weaker than the Earth's ambient field, against which it must be measured. That ratio is not a metaphor or a dramatic flourish. It is arithmetic. And the Earth's field is not perfectly static. It fluctuates with the solar wind, with geomagnetic storms, with the movement of steel and traffic nearby. Even in a magnetically quiet environment, those fluctuations can exceed the brain's whole signal by orders of magnitude. So the measurement problem is not simply detecting a small signal in a large background. It is detecting a signal smaller than the background's own wobble from one moment to the next. This is why the problem cannot be handed to software. Extracting the brain's signal from that fluctuating background without shielding is not a matter of better sensors or cleverer algorithms. Noise and signal occupy the same frequency bands. They carry no independent signature that would allow one to be separated from the other. No amount of post-hoc processing recovers information that was never distinguishable in the recording to begin with. The knowledge base holds a related note from a file of Sharon Weinberger's Washington Post magazine blog material. It reports medical physicists at the Los Alamos National Laboratory developing a helmet-like device intended to make magnetic measurements of brain activity freer from noise. Note the framing even there. Magnetoencephalography is described as plagued by background noise. The frontier of the field is still fighting for the signal at helmet distance. Eleanor White, whose own writing anchors the first part of this series, put the point carefully in her Tech Talk notes, held in the knowledge base. She does not say the idea is absurd. She says it has not been demonstrated by a named mainstream source, even at the distance of a next-door neighbor. She adds that the term is appealing to targets, and that appeal is worth understanding rather than dismissing. 2 knowledge base entries say the same thing in flatter language. The article on evoked potential states that the brain's electromagnetic emissions are extremely weak and attenuate rapidly with distance, making remote detection at satellite range physically implausible. The article on mind reading describes remote neural monitoring as a claimed capability, frequently cited in targeted individual communities, for which no scientific evidence exists. Those are the knowledge base's own words, not this program's gloss. Which brings us to something unusual. Section 6 of the Mind Weapon document, the source text this chapter examines, does what few documents in this genre do. It cites a real, describable civilian research protocol at a named federal facility. So let us go and look at that facility and at that study in detail, because the detail is where the argument is either made or lost, and it deserves a fair hearing. The National Institute of Mental Health's core MEG laboratory sits on the National Institutes of Health campus in Bethesda, Maryland. It is real. It is operated by the Intramural Research Program of NIMH, and its existence, its equipment, and its research output are all publicly documented. Nothing about it is hidden. It is the kind of facility a graduate student can be shown around on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with permission and a visitor badge. The laboratory houses a 275-channel CTF Systems whole-head magnetoencephalography system, the model described earlier in this chapter, using first-order axial gradiometer squid sensors arranged in a helmet-shaped dewar. It has been used for clinical and basic neuroscience research since its installation. A knowledge base entry on superconducting quantum interference devices records the same system, at the same laboratory in the same terms. Nothing about that hardware is proprietary to a secret program. The study cited is an ordinary case control design, of a kind that appears constantly in psychiatric and neurological research. 10 normal control subjects. 10 subjects with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, matched to the controls for age and sex, described in the protocol language as proband subjects, a term borrowed from genetic and family studies in psychiatry. 20 people in total. Volunteers recruited and consented inside a shielded room on a federal campus. Here is the study's stated hypothesis, quoted directly from the source document. Read it slowly because it is the hinge of this whole section. Magnetic field fluctuations in patients with schizophrenia will demonstrate relatively higher values for indices of emergent dynamical structure. That is the entire claim being tested. Every word of it is disease classification language, and none of it is about the content of anybody's thoughts. Now take the words one at a time. Indices means quantitative measures derived from the data, not specific thought content. Emergent dynamical structure is a term from complexity science. Patterns of organization that arise spontaneously in a complex system. Relatively higher values is the language of group comparison, not of identifying an individual. Put together, a researcher testing this is asking one narrow technical question about signal complexity in 20 people, and nothing whatsoever about reading a mind. Set the two enterprises side by side and the gap is obvious. The question has nothing to do with extracting the content of anyone's thoughts, decoding their speech, or reading their memories. It is a biomarker study, an attempt to find an objective signature of a disease state in spontaneous brain activity, and psychiatric neuroscience has been producing exactly this kind of work for decades, entirely in the open. None of this is said to dismiss anyone. People who describe having their thoughts read are describing real distress, and that deserves to be heard rather than laughed at. What we owe them is accuracy about the machine. So next we take this same study apart slowly as 8 plain facts: who was recruited, who approved it, what was measured, and what the measurement could possibly show, and what it could not. That hypothesis, quoted in full, is the most anyone can honestly say the study set out to do. So set the framing aside and lay the protocol out as 8 plain facts, in the order any reviewer would read them. 8 facts, no adjectives. Do that, and the citation stops sounding like a leaked capability and starts reading like exactly what it is: a modest 20-subject psychiatric neuroimaging pilot of a kind that fills the journals. Fact 1. The control group is 10 healthy volunteers, recruited through standard institutional channels and screened for neurological and psychiatric history. Fact 2. The patient group is 10 people with a confirmed diagnosis of schizophrenia, matched to those controls on age and sex, recruited through NIMH's own clinical research programs. Matching on age and sex is not stagecraft. It is the ordinary way a case control design stops 2 obvious variables from explaining your result for you. Fact 3. The instrument is a 275-channel CTF Systems whole-head squid array, the same commercial machine running at dozens of research and clinical sites worldwide. Fact 4. The facility is the NIMH Core MEG Laboratory, federally funded, operating under Institutional Review Board oversight. That means an independent ethics committee approved the protocol, subjects gave written informed consent, and the work complied with the common rule, the federal regulation protecting human research subjects. Fact 5. What was recorded is spontaneous, ongoing brain magnetic activity. Not evoked responses, not task activation, but the brain's resting rhythms, captured while subjects sit quietly with eyes open or closed. Fact 6. The analysis looks at the temporal dynamics of the global electromagnetic field, the statistical structure of those magnetic fluctuations over time, using measures drawn from complexity theory and nonlinear dynamics. Aggregate statistics of a whole signal. Nothing whatever about content. Fact 7. The hypothesis concerns group differences in a disease-related biomarker. Not reading, not decoding, not extracting the content of anybody's thoughts. Fact 8. Like all NIMH intramural research, the study falls under the NIH data sharing policies, so its results may sit in a public database or a peer-reviewed journal where anyone can go and read them. That is the opposite of a covert program. That is a paper trail. Read the 8 facts back and notice what is missing. Nobody was operated on unwittingly. The subjects were recruited, consented, and compensated. An ethics committee reviewed the protocol. The measurement happened in a shielded room, with each person wearing a sensor helmet, knowing precisely what was being recorded. The question asked was about disease classification. The honest observation is not that this study disproves remote monitoring. It is that it never touches the question. Placed side by side, the two enterprises barely overlap. On one side, a biomarker study, two defined groups, one global statistical measure, and a question about whether the numbers differ. On the other, what the claim requires: one unconsenting person, specific content extracted at range. They share a few words of vocabulary and nothing else. Folding the first into the second by simple juxtaposition is not evidence. It is editing. It is worth slowing down on the phrase itself because it sounds ominous and is in fact narrowly technical. The time dynamics of global brain electromagnetic field activity means this: how ordered or how chaotic is the overall pattern of magnetic fluctuation across the whole recording. That is a property of a signal, not a message inside it. Asking whether a signal is more structured in one group is categorically different from asking what somebody is thinking. To be fair to the field, real decoding research exists, and it is genuinely impressive. Kamitani and Tong in Nature Neuroscience in 2005 recovered which of 8 line orientations a viewer was looking at from fMRI. Nishimoto and colleagues in Current Biology in 2011 reconstructed blurred approximations of watched film clips. Tang and colleagues in 2023 recovered the gist of heard speech. Real results published, named and checkable. Every one of those results carried the same price tag. A cooperating subject, held still inside a scanner or living with implanted electrodes. A classifier trained on that one person's own brain responses. Hours of calibration data. A task constrained and known in advance. An output that is coarse and error-prone, giving gist rather than transcript. The most fluent speech decoding published, Metzger and colleagues in Nature, used electrodes resting directly on the cortex. Put a number on the calibration. In the Tang study, each of the 3 participants spent roughly 16 hours inside an fMRI scanner, listening to podcasts, so that the decoder could learn that individuals' own responses. 16 hours of willing, motionless cooperation per person to recover the gist of speech the person was actually hearing. That is the entry price for the best non-invasive decoding yet published. Not a passing satellite. 16 hours. The same team then tested the obvious worry directly. A decoder trained on one person produced nonsense when it was applied to another, and participants defeated their own trained decoder at will, simply by counting backwards by 7s, naming animals, or imagining a different story. The author's own conclusion was that mental privacy holds. Cooperation is needed both to build a decoder and to keep it functioning. That finding sits in the same paper. That caution comes from inside the community, not from a debunker. Eleanor White, an engineer and one of the movement's most careful technical writers, notes in the Knowledge Base's Tech Talk that the term is appealing to targets precisely because it names something they genuinely feel. Her point is that appeal is not demonstration, and that no mainstream source has published such a demonstration at any range under its own name and logo. So where does the phrase actually live? The knowledge base traces it through community writing, through litigation filings, through patent language, and across advocacy websites. It names a real and widely shared experience, and the people using it are describing genuine distress. But a term appearing in a document proves only that the term was written down. It does not prove the capability exists. Those two things get conflated constantly, in both directions. 2 real documents get pulled into this repeatedly. DARPA's Next Generation Non-Surgical Neurotechnology Program, the Knowledge Base Notes, funds work toward non-surgical brain interfaces, and the agency states that it remains in the research phase with no operational deployment. And the National Academy's 2008 report on emerging cognitive neuroscience discussed capabilities that might arrive within 10 to 20 years. a funded program and a forecast. Neither is a working device. Now the physics, because this is where the chapter turns, and where the argument stops depending on anybody's good faith. A small patch of active cortex behaves, to a first approximation, like a magnetic dipole, a tiny current loop. And the field of a dipole does not fade gently with distance. In the far field it falls away as the inverse cube of the distance. That single exponent decides the entire question. Work the latter. Double the distance and the field is not halved. It drops to 1/8. Quadruple it and you are at 1/64. A squid sensor 10 millimeters from the scalp sees perhaps 100 femtotesla. Move it out to 100 millimeters, still well within the same room, and that signal has fallen 1,000-fold, to 1/10 of a femtotesla, already beneath the noise floor of the finest sensors ever built. Take it further. At 1 meter the signal is down by a factor of 1,000,000, to about 1/10,000th of a femtotesla. Not merely undetectable, but physically meaningless in any real measurement environment. And at 400 kilometers, the altitude of a low Earth orbit satellite, the attenuation factor is roughly 6 times 10 to the 22nd power. One number carries this whole chapter, and the number is millimeters. And you cannot buy your way out of this with better sensors because sensitivity buys range only at the cube root. Improve a sensor tenfold, which has taken decades of squid development, and you gain about 2.15 in distance. 100-fold gain buys roughly 4.6. Going from millimeters to meters would demand a billion-fold improvement, with no ambient noise at all. Reaching orbit would demand sensitivity below the standard quantum limit. No published, peer-reviewed method bridges that gap. No proposed mechanism circumvents dipole decay. Not near-field effects, not magnetic resonance, not active illumination of the target. The phrase via satellite is asserted in the source document and never derived from any physical mechanism. That is where the evidence runs out, and saying so plainly is what lets a target argue this in front of a skeptical room. Next, the two pictures set deliberately side by side. Put the two pictures side by side because the contrast is the whole argument in miniature. Picture 1 is documented, repeatable, and published in thousands of peer-reviewed papers. Picture 2 is asserted, in a single phrase with no comparable citation behind it. Nothing that follows asks you to dismiss anyone's experience. It asks only that we look carefully at what each picture actually needs in order to work, and then ask which one has it. Picture 1. A consenting volunteer sits still inside a magnetically shielded room, wearing a fitted helmet of cryogenically cooled sensors positioned within millimeters of the scalp. A technician watches from outside the shield, correcting the volunteer's position, rejecting artifacts, and checking that the liquid helium level in the dewar stays adequate. Every element of that description is load-bearing. Remove the shielding, the cooling, the proximity, or the stillness, and the recording simply does not happen. This is not controversial equipment. It is the daily working reality of magnetoencephalography laboratories at Massachusetts General Hospital, at the University of Helsinki, at the NIMH Core MEG Laboratory, and at dozens of sites worldwide. The knowledge base entry on functional neuroimaging is blunt about the price of that performance. 2 to 3 millimeter spatial resolution and millisecond timing, bought with expensive shielded rooms and superconducting sensors, which is what limits how many hospitals own one. Picture 2 as the source document asserts it. An unaware target in open air at unspecified range, monitored covertly by satellite. Set the two accounts beside each other and the difference is not one of degree. Every condition the working picture requires is absent from the claimed one, and the document offers no mechanism for how any of them were overcome. It does not argue that the barriers were crossed. It simply never mentions them. Count what has quietly vanished. Proximity measured in millimeters. A shielded room. A subject holding still. Informed consent. Controlled conditions. Sensors cooled with liquid helium. Gradiometer geometry that cancels distant noise. Active compensation for the room itself. 8 requirements, each the product of decades of engineering, and each simply absent. This is where a careful researcher plants a flag, rather than swallowing or dismissing the whole claim in one gulp. And this gap is not a subtle one that some classified program might quietly have bridged. The inverse cube falloff of a dipole field is a direct consequence of Maxwell's equations, tested and confirmed from subatomic scales to galactic ones. No black budget program repeals the inverse cube law any more than it repeals gravity. The distance between millimeter proximity and orbital altitude is not a problem awaiting a clever solution. Under known physics, it is an impossibility. So hold 3 things at once, and do not let the first 2 silently vouch for the third. The science is real. Magnetoencephalography, squid sensors, the NIMH study, all genuine and independently citable. The patent is real. United States Patent 6011991, granted and publicly searchable. The covert weapon claim, that these pieces combine into satellite mind reading, rests on no documented mechanism. Keeping the 3 apart is the discipline here. There is a second obstacle, rarely discussed in the covert monitoring literature, and it has nothing to do with distance. Suppose, purely for the sake of argument, that you could somehow obtain a clean magnetic recording from far away. You would still face the question of what it meant. Which pattern of electrical currents somewhere inside a living head produced the pattern you measured outside it? That question has a name in physics. It is called the inverse problem, and it is a well-established theorem in electromagnetic source imaging that it has no unique solution. There are infinitely many configurations of current sources inside a head that produce exactly the same magnetic field pattern at the scalp. This is not a temporary shortcoming of today's algorithms, waiting on better mathematics. It is a fundamental property of the physics, and it does not go away with a faster computer. The analogy is gravitational. The field outside a planet does not tell you how mass is arranged inside it, because many arrangements give the same field. Source localization works anyway in practice because researchers impose constraints. The sources are assumed to lie on the cortical surface, oriented perpendicular to the local folding, and assumed to be few in number. Those assumptions narrow an infinite solution space down to a handful of plausible configurations. Where do those constraints come from? Largely from a structural MRI of that particular person's brain, taken beforehand, so that the model knows where their cortical surface actually sits. They also come from knowing what the subject was asked to do, and exactly when. Inside a laboratory with a cooperative volunteer and calibrated stimuli, those are reasonable assumptions to make. They are earned, one subject at a time, before any decoding is even attempted. Now strip that chain away link by link. For an unwitting person in an uncontrolled environment, there is no prior anatomy, no knowledge of what they are thinking or doing, no calibrated stimulus to anchor the timing, and no cooperation to hold them still. Under those conditions, the inverse problem is not merely hard. It becomes effectively insoluble, and no amount of computing power can supply the constraints that are not there. It is worth being precise about what has actually been decoded from outside the skull. The knowledge base holds a PNAS paper on brainwave recognition of words, using scalp recordings from 5 subjects, filtered between 1 and 20 Hz, comparing EEG against MEG sensor by sensor, electrodes on the head, a small fixed vocabulary per person training, and recognition rates that sit above chance rather than anywhere near fluent. That is the honest published ceiling. There is a third obstacle, and it is the crowded one. The surface of the Earth is not magnetically empty. Every motor, every vehicle, every power line, every piece of ferromagnetic metal produces a magnetic signature that shifts in time and space. Even if you could detect a brain at a distance, which the physics does not permit, You would then have to pull that one signal out of a planet's worth of noise. Working magnetoencephalography solves this by geometry, not by cleverness. The sensor array sits so close to one brain, and so far from every other brain and every other magnetic source, that the signal of interest dominates by sheer proximity. An orbiting sensor has precisely the opposite geometry. From 400 kilometers up, every brain on the visible half of the planet lies at essentially the same range, contributing to one undifferentiated blur. Several billion brains, each producing a signal measured in femtotesla at its own scalp, and an unmeasurably small fraction of that at orbital altitude. The chapter's name for this is source separation, telling one brain apart from all the others. Proximity is what makes that possible in a laboratory, and proximity is the one thing the satellite claim throws away. Distance does not merely weaken a signal. It also destroys any means of saying whose it was. The cocktail party problem, picking one voice out of a crowded room, is hard enough in acoustics. Isolating one brain's magnetic field from an entire planet's, viewed from space, is not in the same category of difficulty. And a note on vocabulary. The knowledge base records that remote neural monitoring is a term drawn from community literature, describing a claimed capability. A term appearing in a document is not a device operating in the world. That distinction matters again when we turn to patent law, because one statute speaks directly to the covert weapon reading of this patent. The Invention Secrecy Act of 1951. Community literature already invokes it. The knowledge base records the writer Paul Baird claiming that more than 5,000 such devices sit sealed under secrecy orders. Set that claim aside for a moment, and look instead at what the statute actually does. Under that act, the Commissioner of Patents may withhold a grant and forbid disclosure where a defense agency judges publication harmful to national security. The application is not published, the patent is not granted, and the inventor may not speak of it on pain of prosecution. Orders are reviewed each year. Several thousand stay active at any time. The Norden bombsight, filed before the Second World War, stayed sealed until well after it ended. So consider what did not happen to patent 6011991. It was examined, granted, and published through the ordinary open process. Had it described a working satellite mind reader in operational use, a secrecy order was available and routinely used, and we would never have seen it. That is not proof the capability does not exist. It is circumstantial evidence the government saw nothing sensitive. Next, what a patent is commercially for. The secrecy order argument has a twin, and it cuts the same way. Ask not only why the government let this patent through, but why an inventor would file it at all. Patent is not a trophy. It is a bargain struck with the public. Disclose your invention completely, in writing, to anyone who cares to read it, and in return the state will protect your right to exclude others for a fixed term. For a utility patent filed after June 8, 1995, that term runs 20 years from the filing date. 20 years of the right to stop competitors, and then the invention belongs to everyone. That exchange only makes sense if there is a marketplace. The whole value of a patent lies in licensing it, or suing someone who copies it. Strip the marketplace away and the document becomes a costly, public confession of nothing. Now apply that to the covert weapon reading. A technology living entirely inside a classified program has no marketplace, no competitors to exclude, and no licensing revenue to defend. Filing publicly would win the inventor nothing, while handing the operating principle to every foreign service that can use a search engine. The two logics point in opposite directions. Commercial invention wants publication. Covert capability wants silence. You cannot have both from the same document. So read what Martirosyan actually filed. United States Patent 6,011,991 describes a communication system that analyses brain activity to control a device. Cooperative user. Contact-based sensing. A person choosing to drive a phone or a computer with their own brain waves. That is the filed register and only the filed register. A granted patent proves that an application was written and examined. Proves nothing was ever built. The knowledge base entry on neural interface technology states the mainstream position in one sentence. Current technology cannot read thoughts or mental states without direct physical contact with the brain. That is not a dismissal of anyone's experience. It is a statement about sensors and distance. Hold it beside the patent and the fit is exact. The document describes contact. The claim describes distance. Nothing in the filing closes that gap. There is nothing exotic about the market such a patent aims at. Inventors have filed brain-controlled interface concepts for decades, aimed at assistive communication for people who cannot speak or move, at hands-free computing, at mobile devices. The knowledge base notes consumer headsets like the Emotive EPOC selling for a few $100s. Those are electrodes pressed against a scalp. Ordinary commercial neurotechnology sold openly, worn knowingly, and nothing like a satellite. Step back now from this one patent because the reasoning we have been unpicking is not confined to it. The claim of satellite-based remote neural monitoring does not stand alone. It sits inside a family of technology claims that circulate together in the targeted individual literature, cite the same handful of documents, and share a single structure of argument. That structure is worth naming because once you see it you can test any claim against it. Voice-to-skull transmission, synthetic telepathy, directed energy weapons, satellite tracking and targeting, electronic harassment through walls, remote neural monitoring. 6 claims largely distinct in physics, yet they travel as one bundle and lean on the same small library of citations. When several claims depend on the same few documents, they do not corroborate each other. They share a single point of failure. Test the citations once and you have tested them all. The pattern runs in 4 moves. First, a real piece of science is identified and cited accurately. A patent, a study, a declassified program file. Second, a far more dramatic claim is placed beside it. Third, credibility transfers across the gap by proximity alone, never by argument. Fourth, everything in between is skipped. The engineering, the physics, the operational requirements, the documented cases. The citation is real. The inference is not. Here is the pattern in the open. The knowledge base records a United States patent application filed in 2020, titled as a system to identify victims of voice-to-skull and remote neural monitoring. Its text asserts that the public patent for remote reading of human thoughts is patent number 3,9,5,1,1,3,4. That is the Malek patent of 1976. The citation is accurate. The conclusion is a leap. A second example also from the knowledge base. The Mind Justice report prepared at UC Davis in 2011 cites a Los Angeles Times article from March 29, 1976, by Norman Kempster, headline Mind Reading Machine Tells Secrets of the Brain. The article existed. The headline was written by a sub-editor in 1976. 50 years later, it is still doing work that no laboratory result behind it can support. None of this is peculiar to targeted individual literature. The same architecture supports cold fusion, anti-gravity drives, perpetual motion. A genuine citation, a spectacular conclusion, and a missing middle. What goes missing is always the same list. The engineering challenges, the physics constraints, the operational requirements, the documented cases, the whistleblower testimony, the paper trail. Those are precisely the things that would move a claim from interesting to established. Their absence is the finding. But there is one difference, and it matters enormously. Cold fusion costs a physicist a reputation. This costs a person their credibility with the people whose belief they need. A doctor, a lawyer, a sister. Every unsupported claim attached to a real account makes that account easier to set aside. and it inflates the perceived threat far beyond what the evidence supports, which is its own kind of injury borne nightly. So let us do the constructive thing and state a standard. What would actually count as evidence for a covert, satellite-based neural monitoring capability? This is not a rhetorical question, and it is not a trap. It is a checklist, and it works in both directions. It disciplines the skeptic as much as the believer, because it says in advance what would change the answer. For items, state them plainly. 1. A demonstrated physical mechanism, stated in the language of physics. 2. A published, peer-reviewed demonstration under conditions resembling the claimed scenario. 3. An operational record with names, dates, locations, and a chain of evidence somebody else can check. 4. A mechanism for covertness that explains how the whole operation escapes notice. Every other technology on Earth is judged this way, from pacemakers to radio telescopes. There is no reason to exempt weapons claims. Take the first two together. What physical quantity is measured? By what sensor, at what sensitivity, over what distance, through what walls, against what noise floor? Then show it working, publish somewhere others can attack it. Brain magnetic imaging, MEG, clears that bar every day, with sensors held millimeters from the scalp inside a shielded room. Nothing in the covert claim has ever been put through the same examination, and the difference is not a formality. The third bites hardest. Patent is not a deployment record. A study is not a deployment record. A deployment record shows this technology used against this person, on this date, producing this effect, checkable by a stranger. The fourth asks how covertness is achieved, how the sensor hides, how one brain is picked out, how the whole operation evades the signal's intelligence every modern state already runs, and how it stays hidden from the target. Now score the claim. The source document meets none of the four. The patent meets none of them, and no patent is expected to. The NIMH schizophrenia study meets none of them, and no clinical study is expected to. 0 of 4. That is not a verdict of falsehood. It is a verdict of not yet tested. As it stands, the claim is an assertion still in search of its evidence. Carry two tools forward. The four-rung ladder. A patent exists, it describes, it works, it was deployed. Most citations in this literature reach rung 2 and are argued as though they reached rung 4. And the distance gap. Chapter 11 takes satellite surveillance, Chapter 12 directed energy weapons, Chapter 16 satellite targeting. Different physics each time. Same question every time. What actually arrives at the sensor? Above what noise? That question is portable, and it is yours. And one habit above all, read the cited study on its own terms. Its design, its hypothesis, its stated conclusion. Then ask whether it can carry the weight the citation puts on it. A schizophrenia biomarker study cannot. Keep your own record structured and checkable at one.witisk.org. Next, we turn to what neural decoding genuinely achieves in the laboratory today, because that story is remarkable enough without embellishment. That method, verify what is checkable, weigh the leap separately, name the gap precisely, now has to be turned on the science itself. Because there is real science here, and it is remarkable. Laboratories are decoding information about mental content from brain activity, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, advancing quickly. Understanding what they have genuinely achieved, on its own terms and independent of any weapon claim, is the only honest way to measure the distance. Two families of instrument dominate this work. Functional magnetic resonance imaging tracks changes in blood oxygenation that follow neural activity. About a millimeter of detail, but seconds behind the brain. Electroencephalography and magnetoencephalography run the other way, millisecond timing, coarse location. EG reads tens of microvolts at the scalp. MEG reads magnetic fields measured in femtotesla. Onto either you bolt a classifier, trained on the responses of one specific brain. In 2005, Yukiyasu Kamitani and Frank Tong, published in Nature Neuroscience. A volunteer lay inside a 3 Tesla scanner holding fixation, while striped patterns appeared at one of 8 angles. From activity in early visual cortex, a classifier recovered which angle. When 2 patterns overlapped, it recovered which one the volunteer had been instructed to attend to. That is real decoding genuinely achieved of the tilt of a line in a fully cooperating person. 3 years later, Kendrick K., Thomas Nasalaris, Ryan Prenger, and Jack Gallant went further, in Nature. They built a model of each subject's visual cortex from 1,750 photographs, then asked which of 120 new images that subject was viewing. One scored above 90%, the other around 70%. Widen the candidate set to 1,000 and accuracy falls away. The 2 subjects were themselves authors of the paper. Notice the shape shared by every one of these experiments. You must already know what the person is looking at, reading or hearing, in order to label the brain data at all. You train on that person, because the folding and functional layout of cortex differ enough between individuals that one person's decoder fails on another's brain. Then you present something new and ask the trained model to choose from a menu you defined. The most striking result came in 2023. Jerry Tang, Amanda Labelle, Shaylee Jane, and Alexander Huff, in Nature Neuroscience, reconstructed continuous language from functional MRI. 3 participants each spent roughly 16 hours in the scanner, listening to podcasts. Afterwards, the decoder produced running text that captured the gist of what they heard or imagined, but not the words themselves. Sometimes accurate in meaning, often wrong in detail, and never verbatim. The authors did something unusual and admirable. They tested their own decoder against the privacy question directly. A decoder trained on one participant, applied to another, performed at chance. And when participants silently resisted, counting by 7s, naming animals, telling themselves a different story, the decoding collapsed. Their own published conclusion is the sentence in front of you. Cooperation is not a convenience of the experiment. It is a requirement of the method. 16 hours. That is what one person had to give, lying still inside a superconducting magnet, head fixed, attending to the material before a decoder worked on that one person's brain. Not 16 hours for the laboratory. 16 hours each. And move the person out of the scanner and the signal vanishes entirely, because the machine measures blood oxygen using a magnetic field it generates and receives at point-blank range. The sharpest decoding uses no scanner at all. It uses electrodes placed on or in the cortex of people who consented to neurosurgery. Edward Chang's group, in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2021, restored a 50-word vocabulary to a man with paralysis through a 128 electrode array, about 15 words a minute, 1 word in 4 wrong. By 2023, comparable implants reached 60 to 78. Life-changing work, all of it touching the brain. Keep the registers apart. Beside demonstrated results sits a second category entirely: work funded, proposed, or predicted. The knowledge base records the 2008 National Academy's report, which discussed detecting cognitive states without cooperation and put that 10 to 20 years out. It records DARPA's non-surgical neurotechnology program, which the agency says remains research with no operational deployment, and a French bioethics prediction of imaging at a distance. Prediction is not a device. Set the 2 columns side by side and the gap is not a matter of degree. It is a difference in kind. Every constraint that makes laboratory decoding work is exactly the constraint the covert claim removes. Say that clearly, and say the other thing just as clearly. People who report being monitored are describing real distress. The mechanism they name and the suffering they describe are separate questions, and only one of them is in doubt. Which brings us to the 2 words that usually finish the claim. Via satellite. The source document we have been examining attaches them to the monitoring claim without further explanation, and they do enormous work in that sentence. They also deserve serious treatment because satellite surveillance is real, formidable, and largely public. Part 16 of this series is devoted to it. Here we need only enough to see what the phrase is carrying. What orbiting systems genuinely do: photograph the surface in visible light, intercept radio traffic that is beamed upward or powerful enough to reach orbit, register heat signatures, bounce radar off the ground and through cloud, and read certain chemical traces in the atmosphere. That is a serious inventory, and it underwrites a great deal of modern intelligence work. Every item on it involves a signal leaving the Earth with energy to spare. The most capable government optical systems are credited with something approaching 10 centimeters per pixel. The best commercial imagery sits nearer 30. 10 centimeters will resolve a vehicle, a license plate, a human figure standing in the open. It will not resolve a facial expression. It will not track the movement of an eye. There is a real ceiling here set by optics and by atmosphere, and it stops a long way short of a skull. Remote neural monitoring is community vocabulary. The knowledge base records it as the alleged ability to detect and decode neural activity at a distance, attributed to quantum sensors or to satellite imaging. It is not a designation used in the neuroscience literature. The knowledge base also archives the writing the claim travels in, an article in English Pravda that states the case flatly, and then offers, in place of a mechanism, a Roman proverb. One document in the knowledge base makes the maneuver visible. It concedes correctly that no satellite carries a brain sensor of any kind, and then keeps the conclusion by relocating it, saying satellites deliver information that a technician at a ground station could use for mind reading. The concession is real. The conclusion simply moves house. What is never supplied is the step in between, how a neural signal reached orbit in the first place. So let us assemble the body on the table. 3 pieces laid out plainly, and none of them requires us to disbelieve the others. This is the discipline the whole chapter has been building towards, and it is harder than either believing everything or dismissing everything outright. It asks you to hold 3 separate judgments at once, and to keep them separate even when they sit uncomfortably together. Piece A comes first, and it is the science. Magnetoencephalography genuinely measures the brain's own magnetic field, a field so faint that the Earth's own is hundreds of millions of times stronger. It manages that with superconducting sensors cooled to 4.2 Kelvin, positioned millimeters from the scalp, inside a magnetically shielded room. David Cohen made the first measurement at MIT in 1968. Today it plans epilepsy surgery. Textbook physics and mainstream medicine. Not classified, not contested, not fringe. Piece B. United States Patent 6,011,991, granted on the 4th of January 2000 to Aris Martirosyan. It sits in the public patent record, and anyone can read it. It describes a cooperative, contact-based, short-range system using brainwave signals to control a communication device, a brain-computer interface concept. Its existence tells us an idea was filed and judged novel. It tells us nothing about whether anything was built. Piece C is the leap, that these combine into a covert, satellite-range device reading an unaware mind is asserted, not demonstrated. No mechanism, no trial, no physics literature at that range, against a femtotesla field falling with the cube of distance. So hold all 3 at once. The science is real. The patent is real. The covert weapon claim is unproven. What that discipline changes for a target and an advocate is where we go next. The 3 pieces are now on the table. Real science, a real patent, and an unproven leap laid between them. Holding those pieces apart is not a debating trick, and it is not a concession. It changes what a target can say, what a researcher can publish, and what an advocate can carry into a hostile room. So take those 3 audiences in turn, and ask what this discipline actually buys each of them. Start with the target. The unease that brings someone to this literature is real, A fear about surveillance, about vulnerability, about being watched. That fear does not need an unproven satellite in order to be taken seriously. Paired with a checkable patent and a checkable laboratory, it becomes an account that survives hostile questioning instead of collapsing at the first fact check. The strength lies not in claiming more, but in claiming only what holds. Say that sentence to a journalist, a lawyer, or a doctor, and every clause in it can be checked within 10 minutes for nothing. Say instead that a satellite is reading your thoughts, and the conversation is over before it starts. The difference is not one of courage or conviction. The first statement is true and verifiable. The second, on the public evidence, is neither, and that asymmetry decides who keeps listening. Two sentences can describe the very same fear. One names a patent number, a laboratory, and an open question. The other names a capability that nobody has demonstrated. A hostile questioner dismantles the second in a single move, then treats everything else you said as equally weak. The first cannot be dismantled because each piece of it sits in the public record. Same fear, same person, two completely different outcomes. Set the two columns beside each other. On the documented side, a granted patent, a federal laboratory, 5 decades of peer-reviewed research into brain magnetism, and an unresolved question about weaponization. On the asserted side, a covert device at satellite range aimed at an unwitting person, reading their private thoughts. Nothing in the left column is disputed. Nothing in the right column has been shown. Keeping that boundary visible is the entire method. Test any claim by asking what a determined skeptic could actually knock down. The knowledge base entry on the 1000-event memory log puts it bluntly. Personal incident logs, however diligently kept, carry no recognized evidentiary value in a courtroom. That is not an insult to the people keeping them. It is a warning that the parts of a case resting only on your own account will be attacked first and hardest. For the researcher, the anatomy built across this chapter is not a verdict. It is a method, and it transfers to the next contested claim this series meets. 3 moves taken in order. Verify whatever is independently citable. Weigh the further leap on its own separate evidence. Then treat the location of the gap as something worth publishing plainly. None of the 3 requires deciding in advance what the answer will be. Verification is the cheap part, and it is astonishing how often it gets skipped. A patent number resolves in seconds on a public database. A laboratory's existence, its instruments, and its published output can be confirmed from the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda. A study's design is printed in its own methods section. All of that is fast, it is free, and it strengthens everything you go on to build. The real frontier is genuinely impressive. Researchers have decoded which image a person was viewing and reconstructed approximate speech, using implanted electrode arrays or fMRI scanners, with cooperating subjects and hours of individual training data. The knowledge base records DARPA's N3 program pursuing non-surgical neural interfaces, while the agency itself states the work remains in research, with no operational deployment. Impressive is not the same as covert or as remote. The third move is the one people resist. Saying out loud, in your own write-up, exactly where your evidence stops can feel like handing a weapon to the opposition. It is the opposite. An account that marks its own boundary can be checked, argued with, and built upon. An account that hides that boundary gets found out by somebody else later in public, and then nothing in it is believed again. For the advocate, this is survival language. The knowledge-based study on official recognition sets out 3 pillars any remedy must pass through: law enforcement and intelligence bodies, governments and legislatures, and the medical and scientific community. Each of those audiences employs people whose job is to find the weakest sentence you uttered. A case assembled only from verifiable parts gives them very little to work with, and gives you a second meeting. Understand what happens the instant the words mind reading and satellite appear in the same sentence. In a newsroom, a committee room, or a doctor's office, the shutter comes down before your second sentence lands. Strip the unproven components away, and the claim becomes this. Real brain magnetism research exists, real patents on brainwave communication exist, and whether either was pushed beyond its documented limits remains open. That version actually gets discussed. Which brings us to the mirror image of the problem, and it matters just as much. Skepticism is not a virtue in itself. It is a tool, and like any tool it can be pointed at the wrong thing. Misplace it and the damage runs in both directions, harming the credibility of targets and of the people dismissing them alike. There are 3 ways to aim it badly. Take each in turn. Aim your skepticism at the patent itself. Insist that United States Patent 6011991 does not exist, or that the patent record is somehow a fiction, and you have denied something plainly checkably true. That error is exposed in one search, and once exposed it discredits every more careful objection standing behind it. Denying the verifiable is the fastest way to lose an argument you might otherwise have won. Aim it at the science instead. Deny that the National Institute of Mental Health runs a core MEG laboratory, or call magnetoencephalography pseudoscience, and you have dismissed a branch of mainstream medicine. In the knowledge base, McMurtry argues that flat rejection of these reports is itself presumptuous, which is an argument about humility, not a demonstration of capability. Wrongly calling the field fake pushes targets further from the scientists they need. The third failure is to aim scrutiny nowhere at all. To take the patent citation, the laboratory citation, and the purpose clause as one seamless, equally credible package. Do that, and you end up asserting a covert planetary surveillance capability on evidence that, examined honestly, does not reach it. The disciplined position is none of the 3. It sits exactly at the gap. Accept what is verified, and say plainly that the leap remains unproven. 3 things to carry out of this chapter. First, a patent is not a weapon. A granted filing proves that an idea was written down, described in enough detail to satisfy the enablement requirement, and judged novel and non-obvious against the prior art. Proves nothing more. Not that a device was ever built, not that the mechanism works as described, and certainly not that anything was deployed against a human being. That distinction is not a technicality. It is the difference between a document and a device, and it carries the full weight of patent law behind it. The knowledge base notes that filings like this one are gathered into community-maintained patent databases as evidence of non-consensual neural monitoring, and it records the standard objection alongside them. Patents need not correspond to operational systems, and the technology described may never have been built. Second, the science is real, but the range has never been shown. Magnetoencephalography genuinely measures the brain's own faint magnetic field, and has done so in peer-reviewed work since David Cohen's first recordings in 1968. Every one of those measurements was made inside a magnetically shielded room, with sensors cooled to 4.2 Kelvin, sitting millimeters from the scalp. Not meters, not kilometers, millimeters, and every millimeter costs signal. Third, separating the layers protects the credible. It is not a retreat from targets' experiences. It is what stops the documented parts, the real patents, the real physics, the real laboratories, from being dragged down by the unproven parts. Examined honestly, remote neural monitoring is not one proposition but 3, of very different evidential weight. Untangling them does not close the question. It shows that the question, on the public record, remains genuinely open. 3 findings, then, and the discipline that keeps them apart is itself the finding. Before we close, let us walk the whole argument back through, quickly and in order, so that you could carry it out of this room and repeat it to a skeptical stranger without losing a single load-bearing fact. What was verified? What was measured, and where? and the exact point at which the published record stops and the assertion begins. Lay the three pieces side by side one last time. Piece A is the science. Magnetoencephalography, MEG, genuinely measures the brain's own magnetic field, and has done so in peer-reviewed work for over 5 decades. Piece B is the patent, real, granted, publicly searchable. Piece C is the leap, that these combine into a covert device reading an unaware person's mind from a distance. A is checkable. B is checkable. C is asserted. The patent first, because it is the easiest thing here to verify. United States Patent 6011991, granted on the 4th of January 2000, to the inventor Aris Martirosyan, who is named here only as the filer of a public document and is accused of nothing. It describes a cooperative, contact-based, short-range system using brainwave signals to control a communication device. You can pull the full text tonight, free, from any browser. The citation asks 4 verbs to do the work of 1. Rung 1, the patent exists, which is true and checkable. Rung 2, it describes a mechanism also true on paper in the language filing's use. Rung 3, that the mechanism actually works as described, is something the patent office never tests. Rung 4, that somebody built it and fielded it covertly against a real person. The document jumps from 1 to 4. The science underneath has an ordinary published history. Brian Josephson predicted his tunneling effect in 1962. David Cohen recorded the brain's alpha rhythm magnetically in 1968, then repeated it in 1972 with a superconducting magnetometer inside a shielded room at MIT. Zimmerman and colleagues published a practical squid design in 1970. None of that is classified. It sits in Science, in physics letters, in the Journal of Applied Physics. And the instrument itself is stubbornly physical. A squid, a superconducting quantum interference device, is a superconducting loop broken by 2 Josephson junctions, held in a flux-locked loop, resolving field changes of a few femtotesla. To do that, the sensor sits in liquid helium at 4.2 Kelvin, inside a vacuum dewar, with its pickup coils pressed as near to the scalp as the engineering allows. Every millimeter of separation costs signal. Now the number that governs everything. The brain's magnetic field at the scalp runs between 100 and 1000 femtotesla. A femtotesla is 1/millionth of 1/billionth of a tesla. The heart at the chest wall produces roughly 50,000 of them. Household wiring 1 meter away about 100 million. Earth's own field some 50 billion. The brain's signal is hundreds of millions of times weaker than the background around it. Stack those magnitudes and the engineering follows automatically. The shielded room, the mu-metal walls, the cryogenics, the close-fitting helmet. None of it is ceremony. It is what it takes to find a signal smaller than the ordinary fluctuations of the field it is buried in. And that matters because here the noise and the signal share the same frequency bands. No amount of clever processing separates them afterwards. You shield first or you get nothing at all. Which brings us to the one word that carries this chapter, millimeters. That is the working distance of every documented MEG measurement ever published. Improve your sensor tenfold and, because the field falls with the cube of distance, you buy roughly 2.15 times the range. 100-fold buys 4.6. Millimeters to meters would demand a billion-fold improvement. To reach orbit, you would fall below the quantum limit itself. The knowledge base states the position plainly, and it is worth hearing in its own words rather than mine. Notice what that entry does and does not say. It does not claim squids are fake, or that magnetoencephalography is pseudoscience because both are mainstream. It says the deployment claim has no reliable public evidence behind it. That is a narrower sentence and a far more defensible one than either of the loose alternatives people usually reach for. It also helps to remember that remote neural monitoring is not one claim. It is 8 claims wearing a single phrase as a coat. Remoteness, neural monitoring, brain linking, delivery by satellite, the inbound direction, covertness, the word completely, and the buried assumption that a filed patent means a fielded device. Each could be true or false on its own. Bundled, they feel inevitable. Unbundled, every one of them must earn its evidence separately. So what would actually settle it? For things stated in advance so that the standard is not invented afterwards. A physical mechanism described at the level of sensors and sensitivities. A published demonstration under conditions resembling the claimed one. An operational record with names, dates, and a chain of evidence. And an account of how covertness works, including how a single brain is picked out and tracked. No claim examined here meets any of the four. The study the document leans on meets none of them either, and was never meant to. At the core MEG laboratory in Bethesda, Maryland, 10 healthy volunteers and 10 patients with schizophrenia, matched for age and sex, sat beneath a 275-channel array. Consent forms. An ethics board. A question about a disease marker, not about thought content. It was folded into a different argument by nothing more than sitting on the same page. Say the verdict precisely because precision is the entire point. And proven is not the same as disproven, and it is not the same as impossible. Nor is silence a form of hidden confirmation. The absence of a published capability is not proof of a classified one. That inference runs in the wrong direction, and it is the commonest way this subject loses arguments it never needed to lose in the first place. Now the honest part, which is what this chapter has not settled. Whether classified work exists that no journal would ever show. Why the Invention Secrecy Act, invoked thousands of times, was never applied to this particular filing, which is suggestive but proof of nothing either way. What actually causes the experiences people report, which physics does not answer. And whether anybody has audited the rest of that patent list entry by entry. Nobody has. None of this tells anyone what is happening to them. People who describe being read, watched or tracked are describing real distress, and often real events, and this chapter holds no authority over anyone's experience. What it offers is narrower and more useful than a verdict on your life. Keep the verifiable things verifiable, and keep the record clean. The declaration guide in our knowledge base puts that instruction far more bluntly than I would dare. Everything in this chapter is traceable, and that is deliberate. The patent from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The physics from Cohen and Science, from Zimmerman in the Journal of Applied Physics, and from the 1993 Hamilton Review in Reviews of Modern Physics. The compiled claim itself from Mind Weapon sections 4 and 6, held in our knowledge base as document 19. Check every one of them. That is the invitation. If this way of working is useful to you, it need not be a solo exercise. TI1 Voice lives at 1.witisk.org. A knowledge base, a declaration you can sign, and a place to log what happens to you in a form that holds up later. TITV runs around the clock at meet.witisk.org. Under Public, TITV. Come and argue with us and bring your sources. Next time we follow the claim upward. Part 16 is satellite-based surveillance and targeting systems, and it asks the question this chapter has set up. What can a satellite genuinely see, track, and resolve on the documented public record? The answer is far more capable than most people expect in some directions, and far weaker in others. And the line between those two turns out to be the whole argument again. Thank you for staying with a chapter that spent 2 hours refusing to hand you a simple answer. That refusal was the point of it. You now have a patent number you can pull, a laboratory you can look up, a physical constant you can check, and one honest sentence about where the record ends. Carry it carefully, use it in rooms where it will be tested, and we will see you next time.